Okay, I think we'll declare a quorum and begin this lecture. This is a lecture that deals with public finance, tax reform. I'll discuss tax reform in the direction of a flat tax. Also discuss the alternative to taxation, namely budget deficits, borrowing to finance government instead of taxing to finance it. And this lecture, I find that it can be given at a number of different levels, depending on how much economics I want to put into it or how much political philosophy I want to put into it. One of my favorite authors is Franz Oppenheimer, who about 90 years ago wrote a book called The State. Okay, The State. And the cover shows a field of dead people, which sort of gives you a preview, a hint, how that argument might go. But in Oppenheimer's The State, he starts off on page 2 of his first chapter, identifying two means of acquiring wealth. And one he lists as production and exchange. And the other one he lists as confiscation. He even puts robbery in there in quotes to explain just what that means. And then he identifies the first means as the economic means and the second means as the political means. He goes on then very quickly to identify the state as the organization of the political means. And he's often running on a political track that is well worth reading even 90 years after it was written. Well, I have some sympathies for Oppenheimer. And yet I'm an economist. I'm a macroeconomist, and economists have a few things to say about taxes and deficits and how some taxes are worse than others and how taxes in some cases might not be as bad as deficits and so on. So we want to talk about that. Also, as a preliminary, I'll mention that I have written some things on the issue of deficits and taxation of one sort or another. It's not my major field. I do mostly macro business cycles and so on, as you've figured out by now. But I have done some stuff in the area of taxes and deficits. Several years ago, 1997, I was invited to do a lecture tour in South Africa. It was in conjunction with the Ludwig Lachmann Memorial Lecture that I was also scheduled to give at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. But the lecture tour took me not just to Johannesburg but to Cape Town and to Pretoria, which is capital of South Africa and the location of the Reserve Bank, so the South African version of the Federal Reserve. And at the Reserve Bank I gave a talk on chronically large federal budget deficits, which of course in '97 was a very hot topic, and was asked by my sponsors later if I would write that up for publication, and so I did. And in fact, I keep it in plain view of my desk just to remind myself of just how bad timing can be when you're writing about deficits. So I put out a monograph. It's called Chronically Large Federal Budget Deficits, The American Experience, and it was published in 1998 at about the time that deficits turned into surplus in this economy. And so this was sort of a non-starter as far as selling a lot of copies, and being published in South Africa didn't help either. And yet now, of course, this is getting revived because our deficits are back. But in some sense, I predicted the arguments in this pamphlet suggest that any turn towards surplus will be pretty short-lived. In any case, as it was, and we'll show what went on during those Clinton years to give us those very temporary budget surpluses. That having been said, I'm going to try to answer a number of questions. So let me just give you a preview of where we're going with that lecture. Number of questions that we'll look at. Does the tax take measure the burden of government? We'll see about that. Are all taxes dollar for dollar equally harmful? That might be a topic that Franz Oppenheimer wouldn't spend too much time on, but we will, because we have some things to say drawing on economics. And are taxes better or worse than budget deficits? And here, I hope we might get some discussion going. I'll try to leave some time for discussion, because the Austrians and the supply-siders have different ideas about this. Supply-siders have become the principal apologists for large government budget deficits. The Austrians are critical of large budget deficits. Is a consumption tax preferable to an income tax? That's a question that was very much debated in the last presidential election cycle, mainly because Steve Forbes was in that race for a time anyhow, and was a supply-sider, was a flat taxer, based his policies on the Holden-Rabushka book. We'll see what that's worth. And then what is the case for the flat tax? And here you might be surprised at my answer. I don't know whether they call it an Austrian answer, certainly not the Austrian answer. But what is paraded around as a flat tax, namely the Hall-Rabushka tax, is not a flat tax at all. So we'll see about that. One of the easy questions to deal with is this business about, is the tax take a good measure of the burden of government? And here I want to give Milton Friedman his due, because he's the one that you associate this point with, is that government spending rather than the total tax take is closer to the mark in gauging the burden. In other words, when the government spends, it's appropriating, one way or another, it's spending and appropriating resources in the economy and making them unavailable to the private sector. And that more nearly measures the burden of taxation or measures the burden of government than taxation, because taxation is just one way of financing that burden. There are other ways. There's printing money, there's borrowing money. Okay, so the deficit would have to add in there before you have a burden measured by taxes. In fact, I put it on there. Government is taxes plus budget deficits. And of course, you actually have to say plus money creation as well. So yes, so we'll spot that to Friedman. Government is a better measure. What I would not spot to Friedman is that therefore it's very much a minor matter about just how the government is financed. What I'll claim later in this lecture is that it can be a major issue, that even if you regard the method of finance of government as a secondary issue, it can be a pretty close second if a huge portion of it is deficit. All right, and we're getting back into a period now where deficits are in fact large, almost by any reckoning that you want to think of. And I would offer an amendment to Friedman's claim, which I view as a friendly amendment. I think he would accept it readily, but I associate this point with Dick Wagner, although I'm sure others have made it, and that is that even government spending doesn't show the total burden, because most anything that can be accomplished by government through taxing and spending or through borrowing and spending can also be accomplished by government through regulation. And any particular regulation will have its tax and spend equivalent, which might have to be added to the burden. Let me give you an easy example here. You could imagine the government deciding that better fuel mileage for our automobiles is a good thing, and is such a good thing, and isn't provided by the market. It's such a good thing that justifies taxing people and using the money to find ways to design cars to make them more fuel efficient. All right, and so that would be an additional burden of government that would be picked up in that case both by the taxing and the spending for that purpose. But the government doesn't do that. Instead, it tries to accomplish that goal through regulation. In other words, it simply imposes through legislation requirements on the automobile industry that it meet certain fuel efficiency standards. And in fact, that particular regulation is probably more of a burden than the tax and spend equivalent, because the regulation is proposed in such a perverse way as to cause all sorts of disruptions in the market for automobiles. It's the thing, for instance, it's the regulation that gave rise to the sport ute, okay, because the sport ute's built on a truck frame, and if you're producing trucks instead of cars, you can get away with more lenient fuel efficiency requirement, and so that was the automobile industry's reaction to that particular regulation. That explains why the demise of the large station wagon with wood paneling on the side. Remember those? I mean, some people didn't like those, okay, but if you're a person who would like to have a large station wagon with wood paneling on the side, I'm sorry, they don't exist anymore. You can't have one because of that particular regulation. That would count as an automobile, and it wouldn't get very good mileage, and the car maker wouldn't comply with the government regulation. So instead, it gives you a sport ute, calls it a truck, and meets the requirement. Okay, so people have fallen in love with their sport utes now, and I drive one too, but I almost can't look at it without thinking it's a product of government regulation. But in any case, the greater point stands that the total burden of government is not measured by just taxation. It's not measured just by government spending. It's measured by that and much else. Okay, are all taxes dollar for dollar equally harmful? Well, you could guess the answer to that is no, and this is just a plea to, when you consider taxation, don't just adopt an anarcho-capitalist attitude and declare them all bad and be done with it, but recognize that some taxes can be more harmful, more disruptive than others. And the general principle that I want to introduce here, and I'm sure there are others equally fundamental, is that the more narrowly the tax is imposed, the more narrow the tax base, the more distortive it tends to be. And the broader the tax base, the less distortive for given revenue. Okay, so if you have a broad base with a low rate, it's likely to create less distortions than a narrow base with a substantial rate. And I'll show you an example of the narrow base by consider George Bush's yacht tax. I don't know how many remember the yacht tax. This is Bush 41. Very politically popular idea because it played in the hands of people who wanted to tax the rich. Okay, tax the rich. It went progressive taxation, and the income tax wasn't progressive enough for people. We'd cut marginal rates at the high end, so let's just get more money from the rich people. Well, how do you do that? Well, rich people buy yachts. So tax the yachts, and the poor people don't worry about it because they weren't going to buy a yacht anyhow, okay? It works that way. Now I'm happy to say, proud to say, that as soon as this was proposed, I introduced it into my principles lectures to show what the actual effect would be, use a little economic analysis to see what the actual effect would be. And it turns out, guess what? This tax hits the poor and not so much the rich. Can you guess why? Well, it turns out that yachts are big ticket items even for the people who buy them. Okay, certainly for the marginal yacht buyer. Okay, a lot of people are rich, and a few are so rich that they can buy a yacht after lunch one day and not notice the difference in their budget. Okay, buy another one tomorrow if they want one. Okay, if they're that rich, well, fine. But most yacht buyers, and certainly the marginal yacht buyer, has to think long and hard before he spends that chunk of change on a yacht. And yet, he's a wealthy person, otherwise he wouldn't even be thinking about buying a yacht. All right? Now, guess what? If you're rich, if you've got lots of money, there are lots of things you could buy. In fact, that's one of the good things about being rich. I'm told. Okay. But, which is to say, in a roundabout way, if you want to use the economic jargon here, is that the demand for yachts is elastic. In other words, at the margin, an increase in yacht prices will cause yacht sales to fall pretty seriously. And people instead, rich people instead, will use their funds in other ways, more vacations on the Mediterranean. I mean, a lot of ways to spend your money if you have the potential of being in the yacht market. In fact, that's just what happened. And so this hit very hard the boat yards that produced yachts and that maintained yachts. And guess who works at those boat yards? It's not the rich, okay? It's not the rich, it's the working poor who are scrubbing yacht decks and things like that, who found themselves out of work. And that effect was so dramatic, and it became so sort of hit you in the face obvious, even to the Bush administration, that eventually it repealed the yacht tax. And it repealed it specifically on that grounds, that it was hurting the poor and not particularly bothering the rich. So a little economic analysis would give you a special reason not to want a yacht tax if you care about the poor, and a lot of people do. I do. Okay. On the other hand, and be careful with this, but it says a broader tax base, the less distortion of economic activity. So consider an income tax. That's about as broad a base as is ever considered, with a low rate. And I'll put the emphasis on the low rate. You know, don't I hope the headline on this lecture isn't, you know, Garrison recommends income taxes. You know, that's not quite it. It's just that one characteristic of an income tax, whatever bad things you have to say about it, is that if the base is broad, and it is, that's what we mean by this income tax, then the rate can be very low, and people don't have good alternatives to earning income. Okay, it'll have some effect at the margin, in fact, timing of retirement and so on. But at the same time, with the broad base and low rate, then that effect becomes not particularly significant. Okay. Are taxes worse than budget deficits? Now here we go with some controversial aspects of it, but here as an aside, I just point this out because it's something that's kind of fun to contemplate, is that governments, of course, always run deficits, sometimes bigger than others and sometimes just astronomical. The latest budget deficit that I just reported within the last several days for the current budget is $450 billion. The apologists for the Bush administration, of course, go into high gear trying to explain how that's not all that high relative to something. We'll see how that goes. It's kind of fun to watch, to see how somebody can talk $450 billion in really being a small amount of money. You know, don't worry about it. But you always have your apologists, but they flip-flopped on the issue. In the 1960s, the old bromide was we owe it to ourselves. Okay, this was popularized by Abba Lerner and many others. Don't worry about the deficit because we owe it to ourselves. And it's one of these arguments, I think it was Murray Rothbard that pointed out, one of these articles or arguments that proves too much, because it means there's a lot of other things we don't have to worry about too. You know, so don't worry about thievery because we're just stealing from ourselves. You know? And then when you realize why that's wrong, you can realize why owe it to ourselves. Some people owe it to others, and it can cause troubles along the way. But now we have, you know what the current apologetics are, and this actually comes out of the supply side school. In the 21st century and before, is we have access to world capital markets. All right, and I'm going to put that in perspective shortly. But I'll say now that I think I know what that means, and I think most of you know what that means. But generally, that's sort of a baffling thing to say, as I've discovered in mentioning this at lunch to my wife. I don't talk to my wife very much about economics, you know, but every once in a while I'll blurt out something. And I think I said something at lunch about the deficit figures, and I always like to think of it in terms of daily borrowing. And you know, the budget deficit gets over $365 billion, and well, there's $1 billion a day. Now it's $450 billion, so government's borrowing well in excess of $1 billion a day. And even my wife couldn't, she's not, she plays flute, okay, she's very good at it. We have an agreement, I don't try to play the flute. But even that sort of got her attention. Is, well, how does the government do that, How do you go out and borrow over $1 billion and then come back the next day for more, I mean, you don't get a picture, what does that look like? And I thought I had the answer. I said, well, they have access to world capital markets. Well, that meant nothing to her. What does that mean? Okay. Well, of course, we have an idea what it means, that the government bonds are purchased in large part by foreigners, by central banks of other countries. Routinely, they have large quantities of those debt instruments in their own portfolios, and those portfolios are growing in that regard daily. But we'll come back to that because it's something to think about. How did we get from we owe it to ourselves to we have access to world capital markets? And here's a question that if it weren't for all of the apologetics that come out of Washington, wouldn't feel like I had to answer. Is $450 billion a lot of money? How much time are we going to spend answering that question? And yet we do have to spend time answering it because all of the apologetics are directed towards suggesting not that much money. Okay, so let's take a look at the way that the deficits get presented. And one of the primary things, and you'll see this even in articles that claim to be objective and unbiased, all right, that as soon as the big number is announced, $450, the very next sentence is going to be something about this is such and such a percent of GNP, all right, which is relatively small. I didn't look it up. It's down there 2 or 3%, whatever it is, but a relatively small percent of GNP. But if you think about that, you're not too impressed with the smallness of that number, because what you learn in the principles course is GNP essentially is everything, isn't it? That's the whole shooting match. That's the value of all of the output in a given year of the economy. Okay, so the GNP is essentially everything, and it almost follows trivially that almost anything is small compared to everything, right? Even the budget deficit. So we'll see later what would be a more relevant comparison if you're really looking for a denominator to stick under the deficit. But I would argue it's not GNP. Another is to compare with private borrowing, and you have to sort of think your way through this. Yeah, government borrowing is increasing, but so too is private borrowing. And in some periods in the recent past, it's even private borrowing has increased even more than government borrowing. So why are people giving the government such a hard time? They're borrowing too. But think of what that's saying, because if there's a worry about government borrowing, it's this government putting tremendous demands on credit markets, okay? Tremendous demands on credit markets. Now, does it make you feel better if you know at the same time the private sector is putting tremendous demands on those same credit markets? I don't think so. In fact, this sort of hints towards what the right answer is. We want to see, well, what about the supplies of credit? Don't tell me about even bigger demands for credit. Tell me something about supplies of credit that make this amount of borrowing no worrisome thing. Similarly, compared to budget deficits of other Western countries, let's grade on a curve here. The U.S. isn't doing too bad compared to Italy or whatever. And of course, some countries are worse than others. But still, the U.S. economy is a big economy, and the amount of deficit it has, certainly relative to its GNP, matters a lot. Now, here's the key. What I've done in my monograph that was published in South Africa is to compare budget deficits to saving. And now, isn't that the relevant comparison? In other words, how much is the government borrowing relative to what there is for borrowing, relative to the supply of credit? What's the demand relative to the supply? That seems to be the relevant comparison, and not these others. And it turns out if you look up the figures, you'll see that upwards of 30% of private savings is a government deficit. Now that's not to say that the government is doing its borrowing strictly from you people, strictly from U.S. citizens. If it were, and we'll see this too, if that's what the government did, is do all of its borrowing from domestic savers, then it would take such a huge chunk of those total savings that what was left for private industry would be pretty scarce, and the interest rate would be bid up tremendously. It's called crowding out. We'll see that too. And so it turns out that the government doesn't get all of its funds from U.S. savers. In fact, it gets relatively little of its funds from U.S. savers. It gets them from savers around the world. That's the world capital markets, and savers in England, and savers in Japan and Germany, and to a large extent central banks in those countries that are willing to lend the government funds. And this is what is meant by, look, if you want to compare to savings, don't compare to U.S. savings, but to world savings. Okay, so again, it's not surprising that the deficit of any given country is relatively small compared to total savings in all the world. Okay, so that's compared to world credit markets. I had some email back and forth on the Mises, one of the Mises chat lists, with a supply-sider who took me to task for arguing that the deficit to saving ratio was the relevant ratio, and claiming instead, no, there's trillions of dollars. And I tried to look up how much is total world savings, and I couldn't find any good solid figures on it. If anybody's got figures on that, let me know. But it could be around 12 trillion dollars. But his point, he didn't come up with figures either. I asked him, okay, how much are world savings? He didn't come up with figures either, but said, well, but it's so huge, so large, that U.S. borrowing is just a drop in the bucket. Just a drop in the bucket, and he went on to say that borrowing in world capital markets and spending in the U.S. is the closest thing we'll ever see to a free lunch. Okay, so enjoy it while it lasts. Okay, but just you wait till it quits lasting, and you're going to get the full bill. Okay, you're going to pay your. Okay, and again, there's a Rothbardian argument to make that it proves too much. Rothbard was a master at this kind of a critique of economic arguments. So I think it's probably one of the first counter arguments that would come to his mind, that if it's true, it really proves too much, because if it's just a drop in the bucket, then surely we'd recognize that taxes are a burden, aren't they? And so why have any taxes at all? Right now, the total government spending is financed about 20% or so by deficits, and the rest by taxation. So that means that if you borrow the entire amount for spending and just cut all taxes to zero, then you're only taking 5 drops in the bucket. Okay, these world capital markets, they're still huge, even compared to all the borrowing that would be required to eliminate taxes. So why not eliminate taxes totally? And I pose the question more specifically to the supply-sider, and haven't yet gotten an answer. If I could pose it to supply-siders among us, and I think there are some here. What would constitute excessive borrowing if $450 billion isn't? We'll get to it in the question and answer session.
That you were asking the supply-side for the answer.
Well, we got an eager supply-sider here. Okay. What would be an amount that couldn't be dismissed with a wave of the hand as being only a drop in the bucket compared to world capital markets? Okay, well, let me back up then to this business of deficits measured relative to saving. And this is a figure depending on whether you use private and corporate savings or domestic savings or what, but it's somewhere around 25-30%, along in that range somewhere. And let me show you why that matters. if the government is borrowing that large a portion of savings, then it turns out that the Treasury, the government, is in the role of what's called a big player. Fritz Machlup popularized this article. Markets work best when you don't have any big players among the buyers and sellers. Entrepreneurs can predict better what market conditions are likely to be and how they might change. But if you have a big player in the market, then all bets are off unless you can predict what that big player is going to do. Right? It's a job trying to figure out what's the big guy going to do. That's what matters. And what he does is going to affect market conditions in ways that, boy, you better be prepared to deal with. If you can't predict what that big player is going to do, then you might be in trouble. You might be subjecting yourself to a lot of risks of bankruptcy in the case you can't deal with the market conditions that come along. So the example I'm using is close, but not, it's probably a little low because it's figures from a few months back. But the example I have, suppose government spending is, what is that? $2.2 trillion, okay? And suppose taxation is $1.8 trillion. Well, that's a deficit, isn't it? In this case, $400 billion. It's not too far off from the 450 that's current. I'm passing over a lot of arguments by people like Robert Eisner, who claim that this is the wrong way to calculate the deficit. I'm just taking it that's the right way. I think it is. I mean, how do you calculate the deficit? What you spend, what you can finance with taxes, the difference is the deficit. And certainly for the application that I have in mind, it's the right calculation, even if it's not the most appropriate one, say, for some other context. Okay. Now, the trick is, think about this difference between the tax-financed government spending and the deficit-financed government spending. That however much that we hate to pay taxes, however much we wish they were lower, at least we know what they are, or we hire accountants who know what they are. I know it's confusing. There's a very complicated tax code, and it takes some doing to figure out just how it will impinge on you as a businessman or you as an individual. But we deal with it, okay? And we hire accountants to help us if we can't do the job ourselves. And the term I used a minute ago is key. There's a tax code. It's written down. The government has committed itself, at least until further legislation is passed, to collect taxes in some specific way. So during a tax year, you can plan your affairs accordingly. All right? You can do what you can to arrange your affairs so as to shield yourself the best you can against paying more taxes than you'll be able to, right? And that's key. Okay, so there's a tax code. But is there a deficit code? And I think you'll see just by looking at the term, you think, well, that's a term I've never seen before. Well, of course you haven't seen it before, because there is no deficit code. There is no obligation on the part of government to decide now or to tell you just how that deficit is going to be accommodated, just where the money's coming from, and just how it's going to affect you or your business, all right? And yet it's got to come from somewhere, and where it comes from can change and can change dramatically. And when it does, it can affect you in a big way. Now, to plan your affairs, you better be guessing what's going to happen to that deficit. But boy, if you guess wrong, you might lose big. Okay, and I'll show this. I'll show what the different examples are and how it works out. So there is no deficit code. And this is what makes the method of raising the funds to spend very important, okay? Because essentially what the government is doing is putting you on notice. They're saying, look, we've got expenses this year, okay? They're over $2 trillion, and we're going to finance it. Now, we're going to finance most of it through taxes. We're going to collect $1.8 trillion, according to the tax code, and that's how we'll pay for most of it. But then we need a $400 billion kicker. Okay, we're going to need more, and we're going to get it. Okay, and we're not going to tell you just whose or just when or just how, but we're going to get it. Now, go ahead and conduct your affairs. You know? And you're not quite sure which direction to head, okay? Because you want to do whatever you can do to avoid being the person that has to pay up, okay? So that's the way it works. Now, let's look at the short list of alternatives. And actually, I could list about 5 things. I'm going to list 3 that involve accommodating the deficit. In other words, how do you get this money? And 2 more that would amount to reducing the deficit, so you don't have to borrow so much money. But I'll focus, because I'm talking about deficits, on how do you accommodate it. One is you could borrow domestically. Okay, you could borrow domestically, and let's say you borrowed most of that huge amount of funds from private savers. Well, that would mean that business in the U.S. Would have precious little funds to borrow, and interest rates would go sky high. This is what's called in your textbooks crowding out, okay, that the private sector gets crowded out by public borrowing. You could borrow from the Fed. This is called monetizing the debt, okay, where the Federal Reserve issues Treasury bills, sells them into the market, and at the same time the Federal Reserve, accommodating the Treasury, buys an equivalent amount of Treasury bills and holds them in its own portfolio. So it's sort of a 1-2 action whose net effect is that the IOU gets printed up by John Snow and passed to Alan Greenspan, who creates the funds for John Snow to spend. Okay, it's kind of an operation that makes your head swim if you think about it. You think, how does this work? Because I've had students ask me how to get their debt monetized. Having trouble spending my debt. I need somebody to monetize it for me so I can spend it. So nobody can do that except John Snow. He gets his debt monetized. But and of course, monetizing the debt, that adds to the money supply, drives up prices. You get inflation, doesn't it? That's another consequence. Or borrow abroad.
One quick question.
Yes.
Is monetizing the debt the same thing as just printing money to spend?
Pretty close to it, although the printing, when most macroeconomists talk about printing money, they're using the term printing metaphorically. It's typically checking account money. Okay, in other words, John Snow's account is credited with those funds. But yeah, as far as the sort of macroeconomic consequences, creating money to spend, creating money to buy the Treasury bill that was issued. Yeah.
Do they have to give money back to the Fed later on?
Yeah, because most of this debt is short term, 6 months or so. At which point they borrow some more they roll it over.
They print the money, they spend the money, then they destroy the money when they pay it back.
Well, they don't destroy; they roll it over. Is what they do. In other words, they borrow more.
They borrow more.
They keep it going. Okay.
Right, but in principle, they're supposed to be paying the Fed back and
Oh, yeah.
destroying the money with it.
Yeah. If they did that, that's the way it worked. But they don't do that. Of course, they roll it over. Okay. Let's go to the third alternative, which is borrow abroad. This is the access to world credit markets. But that has its own consequences too. In fact, let's list all 3 consequences. Borrow domestically, you get high interest rates and crowding out. Okay. Borrow from the Fed, you get inflation. Okay. Borrow from abroad, you get weak export markets, and you might be able to see how this works. But let me explain it very briefly. Is that if the U.S. government has this insatiable demand for credit, it has to pay a high enough interest rate to attract lenders, and it doesn't have to, so it can pay an interest rate that will attract some foreign lenders. So you take foreign trading partners who in ordinary times would show up at our shores with a load of goods, maybe electronics and cameras and whatever, sell them into the U.S. market and take the funds and buy U.S. goods from the export industries, load them up on their boats and go back. Okay, that's called international trade. Okay? So during a period of high budget deficits that's being accommodated largely by access to world credit markets, then what we find is the boats show up with goods in their cargo compartments, but they leave with treasury bills in their glove compartments. Okay? And the export industry is in the toilet. Okay? So you get a strong damper on export markets when you borrow abroad. Now, if you look at these three possibilities, what you can identify is different administrations who have used different ways of borrowing. And you might think this is kind of odd. If you think like an economist, you think, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't the government sort of adjust at the margin and borrow some domestically, borrow some from the Fed, borrow some abroad, so that the marginal cost of borrowing is about the same across the three ways of doing it? Okay, it's not like a sort of economic solution to the government's problem. And yet what happens is that the actual cost of this borrowing in terms of social cost, macroeconomics, and so on, aren't that easy to perceive. And the way the costs impose themselves on the government anyhow is by those costs eventually being perceived by the voters, who then vote against people who want to keep doing that. All right? Well, that's a time-consuming process. And so what tends to happen is that administrations will binge. This is an insight I get from Thomas Sowell in his Knowledge and Decisions, that governments will tend to binge first on one method of finance, and then when that becomes politically unpopular, they'll shift and binge on some other method of finance. Then when that's politically unpopular, they'll binge on some other one. Okay? So that's the way it works, and you probably can identify the administrations. Look here. The last serious episode we had of crowding out, high interest rate, at the time it was called a credit crunch during the Nixon administration. Very high interest rates, a whole lot of articles in the Wall Street Journal about the credit crunch and what to do about it, and it was all of the borrowing by the government of domestic savings, keeping interest rates high. It became a very unpopular thing, and so that later presidents didn't want to do that. Jimmy Carter didn't want to do that, and so borrowing from the Fed, monetizing debt, became the thing to do in the Carter administration. So you didn't have crowding out, you didn't have high interest rates, but boy did you have money creation. and inflation rate got up into the double digits. That's where the popular term double-digit inflation comes from, the Carter years. And eventually that was so unpopular that Reagan was able to run for office and actually win, partly on the basis of pulling the plug on the printing press, stopping the inflation. But with Reagan, of course, he borrowed abroad. He was the president that started all the borrowing abroad and access to world credit markets and so on. And as a result, we had some dire conditions in the lumber industry in the Northwest and other industries that relied heavily on the export business. Okay? If we want to update that to the current period, Bush, Clinton, and Bush actually continued the access to world credit markets, but of course he was opting for a third or a fourth strategy, which is reduce the deficits by high taxes. You remember his no new taxes, which actually turned into new taxes. So dealt with it that way. Clinton dealt with it with the artificial boom, because if you trigger an artificial boom, then during the boom time, you have income higher and therefore tax revenues higher. You have fewer people unemployed and therefore less payouts to the unemployed. And in that way, you can at least temporarily turn a deficit into surplus. The dominant effect of the Clinton years. And now we're back pretty much to borrowing abroad, especially after the tax cuts of the current Bush administration. But and I'm here to say that the cost of the borrowing abroad binge hasn't yet made itself felt, which is why some of the supply siders say it's the closest thing to a free lunch. But if and when it does, then that lunch is going to have to be paid for. If our foreign trading partners decide, maybe on the basis of the escalating deficit, that the U.S. isn't quite as creditworthy as was once thought, then they may quit lending to us. And if they quit lending to us and the U.S. starts monetizing the debt, you start getting inflation, and then you're likely to precipitate a severe reduction in foreign trading partners' willingness to lend. And that has to be dealt with domestically, which will cause some combination of the other two problems. Okay? So it's not a free lunch after all. Now I want to turn, while I've got this on the screen, to an interesting empirical question, and because there's some very interesting results if you know how to interpret them. But I think generally they end up misinterpreted. Look at those first three lines, high interest rates, inflation, and weak export markets. And it suggests that government borrowing causes those things. Well, in the economics profession these days, everybody thinks in terms of doing the empirical studies and seeing, let's look at the numbers and see if it's true. Of course, the Austrians who do episodic history, they know where the truth is in this regard. In other words, they know that Nixon borrowed domestically, increased interest rates, and gave us crowding out, and that Carter monetized the debt, gave us inflation, and that Reagan sold debt abroad and gave us weak export markets. Okay, that's the macroeconomic history of those particular episodes. But the modern technique in empirical economics is not to do episodic history at all, but rather to look at all the data. I mean, let's be global about it. Let's go back and look at macroeconomic data, and good modern macroeconomic data begins in 46 or 7 after World War II. Right? So virtually all the tests, statistical tests done, are based on not these particular episodes, but on the general pattern of deficits and of inflation and of interest rates and of export trade, the trade deficit, looked at over this whole period. Okay? And so there are lots of studies, individual studies, and let's just survey some of them and see if you can see what's going on here. There's a whole bevy of articles that is addressed to the question, do deficits cause high interest rates? Okay, and how do you determine that? Well, you look at the deficits from 1947 to present, correlate it with interest rates from 1947 to present, and see if there's a good fit. Okay, now we know that in the Nixon administration we had crowding out and high interest rates. Okay, but we're going to look at them over the whole period. What can you guess the results would be? Well, the results are, well, okay. I've got, you're going to me. I've got the next question before I give some answers. Okay. The next bevy of articles, and there are a bunch of those too, do deficits cause inflation? And a lot of articles, the one that particularly comes to mind because I wrote a comment on it, was one by Gerald Dwyer a number of years ago, where he used a statistical procedure that's actually called a causality test. And of course, if you learn anything in elementary level statistics, you learn statistics doesn't establish causal relationships. It just establishes correlation. But Clive Granger, who got a Nobel Prize a year or so ago for his work, invented something called Granger causality, and his name even gets appended to the verb, where A, Granger causes B, which sort of is a little bit of a warning there that is a special kind of cause. And what the people using that technique do is that they'll introduce Granger causality, but when they get around to the conclusion, they've just got, they dropped the Granger part. And so, but he came to the conclusion with his statistical test, and of course his test, significantly in the context of my current lecture, used all of the data from 1946 to present to look at deficits and to look at inflation to see if deficits Granger cause inflation. And you can guess the answer he came up with using all that data. They don't. And my comment was built up to making the point that deficits Webster cause inflation. Okay? I prefer the old method, Do deficits cause trade imbalances? And here during the Reagan administration, the key test was, do budget deficits and trade deficits move together? You even hear in the articles in the financial press about the twin deficits in the budget and in the export trade. Okay, do deficits cause trade imbalances? And again, we know they did in the Reagan administration and beyond, when the U.S. had access to world capital markets. And yet, if you look at the whole period from 46 to present, that gets washed out. It gets sort of lost in the noise. So now let's go back and show what each one of them found, and this is summarizing a number of articles, that the results were weak and mixed, okay? Weak and mixed. Well, of course they were weak and mixed. You know, there's that Nixon period in there. And do deficits cause inflation? Weak and mixed, okay? Do deficits cause trade imbalances? Weak and mixed, okay? There's articles, Paul Craig Roberts, supply side, are talking about the hysteria over deficits. Why do these people keep worrying about the deficits? Any particular thing they're worrying about doesn't have any support in the data, all right? And of course, this is perfectly consistent with the argument I make about the big player, is that if you're a chief executive officer of a big firm, you're trying to plan your affairs, you need to know how this deficit's going to affect you. And these studies aren't going to help you at all. They're not going to tell you, you know, which bear is going to eat you. They don't. You just don't know, you know. And so you got to plan your affairs accordingly. But of course, for political purposes, it works great, because do deficit cause any problem at all? Okay, and you just have to add up what's weak and mixed plus weak and mixed plus weak and mixed. You know, you just don't worry, be happy. Don't worry about the deficit. Okay? So the big player argument, though, suggests that the deficits are a lot to worry about. And in fact, I've made the argument in my book, In Time and Money, that that factoring in this effect helps to explain why current interest rates in the U.S. remain low despite all of the government borrowing. And they remain low because of the big player effect. In other words, one thing that will keep businesses out of credit markets, will keep them from borrowing to undertake investment, is interest rates. So if the interest rate's high, they won't borrow. And that's what happened in the Nixon administration. High interest rates, they didn't borrow. But another thing that will keep them out of those same credit markets is just tremendous uncertainty about the future macroeconomic climate in this country. That's an uncertainty that derives from those large budget deficits. Okay, so even if you could borrow in the low single digits, you might be hesitant if you just don't have a clue about whether you're going to be facing weak export markets or high inflation or high interest rates, because you have to plan for those things in different ways, and if you plan for one and the other emerges, then you're in trouble. So better just stay liquid, set it out, and wait for better times when the government has its own house in order, and then you can borrow. So what I'm suggesting here is that you can get a crowding out effect that doesn't work through interest rates, but works through uncertainty about future business conditions. Okay. Now, fifth question. I'll go through these quickly because I do want to have a little bit of discussion. Is a consumption tax preferable to an income tax? And of course, the supply-siders would like to have you believe that it is. And I suggest that their arguments are at best question-begging. That consumption is a pretty broad-based tax, and income is a little broader-based tax. Okay. It might be difficult to make a choice between which one you would prefer. Okay, but the supply-siders would have you believe that there's something defective about the income tax and that it taxes some income twice. Okay, and they can make their argument only by assuming from the get-go that the consumption tax is really the appropriate tax. Okay, so if consumption is the appropriate tax base, then the income tax is inappropriate because it taxes some consumption twice, taxes some income twice. On the other hand, if the income tax is the appropriate base, then the consumption tax leaves some of the base untaxed, which requires then a higher rate for the consumption tax. So there's a trade-off. You could go either way, but I don't think there's any way of effectively claiming double taxation. Let me show it to you in terms of my own macro framework. And actually it works out fairly easily. There's the basic framework that I've had on the screen a couple of times already in earlier lectures. And I'm allowing the production possibilities frontier to describe here the after-tax possibilities. After you paid your taxes, how much consumption can you have, or how much investment can you have? And I'll assume that the tax currently in force is the income tax. You have an income tax, and after you paid your taxes, that's the consumption and investment that's possible. Now, if you switch from income tax to a consumption tax, which is the same thing, by the way, as an income tax that exempts saving and investment, then the production possibilities frontier changes. In other words, consumption has to be taxed more heavily because it's a smaller base than income. So it doesn't allow you quite as much consumption as before, but investment isn't taxed at all, so you're allowed more of that than before. All right? So effectively that PPF will rotate so that less consumption now is possible, but more investment is possible. All right? And I can show that effect like so. Okay? And so what you have is just a different PPF. You have a different point on the PPF where you expect to find the economy, taking advantage of the fact that saving and investment aren't taxed. They'll do more of it, even if they have to forego current consumption. You'll find more saving, but for that same reason, it's not taxed. You find more investment because it's not taxed. So saving, supply and demand for loanable funds will both shift to the right with no particular effect on the interest rate. It could go a little up or a little down depending on some particulars of the tax policy, but no reason to think it's going to go hard in one direction or another. And a structure of production that is more future-oriented. Now here's one instance in my diagrammatics where you get a change in the structure of production that's not reflected in a change in the interest rate, because that change is explained by the tax effect, okay, and not by an interest rate effect. So that would be the effect. In other words, it would cause economic activity to be more future-oriented, right? But that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, what's wrong with the present? You know? We want people to make their own choices between how much to consume now and how much to consume later, and not have those choices be based on the particulars of the taxes that are in effect. Okay, one more question that I can answer pretty quickly too. What's the case for the flat tax? And I have one article I have in the Freeman. In fact, I've made copies available up here if somebody wants to pick one up. Is an argument that a flat tax is not necessarily a simpler tax if it's to collect as much revenue as the current income tax collects. In fact, I have an acronym that makes that point. You all know of TANSTAFL. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. It comes from Robert Heinlein and so on. Well, this is my own acronym that says there ain't no such thing as a big, simple tax, okay? If it's big, people will find a way to make it not simple, to find a way to work around it. And not, you know, that's good. That sort of gives me a warm feeling. You know, I'd hate to think that people would actually calculate their tax on the back of a postcard and then paperclip their check to it, you know, and send it off in the mail. I don't think they would do that. In fact, in the article, what I argue is that the flat tax, if anything, just changes the battleground, so that instead of earning an income and arguing about deductions, you just work on a contract basis with your employer and you receive revenue against which you take costs off and argue about what constitutes income. So it just changes the battleground, gives much, much more work for the tax lawyers, but doesn't make the thing any more simple. The only simple tax would have to be a low tax, right? If it's low enough, then people will pay it and not worry about the particulars of it. I'll pass over that because I make those arguments in my article. The thing that's wrong with the current proposals for a flat tax is they have this huge personal exemption of $25,000, $36,000, something like that. And if you have a flat tax with a large personal exemption, then what you do is you pit the high-income voters against government and the low-income voters, okay? And I'm sorry, government and the low-income voters are going to win, okay? Because they're not paying the tax anyhow. They want more government programs to be paid for by the wealthy. So if there's a flat tax that's worth considering, it's a flat tax without a large personal exemption, in which case you pit the high-income voters and the low-income voters against the government. And that's got some chance of being worthwhile. Okay. So let me conclude there and maybe take a question or two, and then because we're pretty close to out of time. Yeah.
If people know that they're going to have to pay the government deficit eventually, wouldn't they be inclined to save the money that they're getting from the government due to the deficit?
I don't think so. That's the old Ricardian equivalence theorem. I recognize it as the Ricardian equivalence. And certainly the empirics don't bear that out. In other words, saving is not growing at nearly the rate that the deficit is. So people aren't doing that. And in fact, one of the reasons people worry about the deficit is precisely the fact that people aren't doing that. If people were doing that, hey, there's nothing to worry about. Because if people individually look at government spending and realize their taxes aren't quite paying for it, and so they're just stashing away the difference, knowing that government's eventually going to have to come and get it. If that's what was happening, then Ricardo would be right, and there would be nothing to worry about. It's precisely because people don't do that gives us a worry. Yeah.
Is there any point in analyzing interest rates regarding macroeconomics in the United States, since the Federal Reserve unilaterally sets the interest rate?
Okay.
They control how much credit they can create.
Let me ask you to re-raise that question in our macro roundtable. Okay. But I realize we're out of time and there's another class coming up. So let me cut it out, but I'll answer questions individually. Thank you.